This is the OK Conversation on OKFM 99.5. We have with us Dr. Robtel Pailey. She's right here with us, taking some time out to hold a conversation on our country. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Julius.
Just come a little closer to
Sure. Thank you for having me, Julius.
How is life? I know you're usually shuttling between Monrovia and London and sometimes Washington. What's going on?
Life is good. I have no major complaints, except the fact that the world is falling apart. But besides that, everything is good.
Falling apart? That's a bold, heavy claim to make.
In the sense that geopolitically, there's not much to be excited about in terms of positivity out there. And not just within the context of Liberia, but just the world. I think there's an absence of real leadership across the globe.
Can I take it that you're sounding apocalyptic?
No, it's not apocalyptic. I would say that it's just me being a realist. I was just outside in your green room, and I was watching footage on Al Jazeera of Gaza being reduced to rubble. And you can even ask your producers, I was on the verge of tears. I mean, seeing that kind of footage, we should all be appalled. We should all be up in arms about the fact that this genocide is taking place right in front of our eyes, and nothing is being done about it. So I'll just end there because I don't want to tear up and start getting emotional, but I think I'm in a very reflective position right now, and it's a difficult time to be someone who's interested and conscientious about the world and wanting to see the world transform for the better for everybody.
Well, and that's why we have you here. Almost a year ago, we're just like close to a month shy of that time, you delivered one of the most memorable Independence Day speeches in Liberian history. It's going to go down as just one of the greatest, one of the best, one of the most controversial, one of those that just touched everywhere. And well, different reactions and everything else. But first of all, what went into that?
It's funny that you say that. So there were people who read the speech who were not even Liberians. So I'll give you an example. When the speech was delivered a few weeks afterwards, one of my undergraduate students at the London School of Economics sent me this heartfelt letter. And she said she read the speech from beginning until end. And for her, it was like my love letter to Liberia. My love letter to Liberia. And I hadn't even thought about it in that way, but I thought it's such a beautiful way of encapsulating that speech. It was my love letter to Liberia. Because when you love something so deeply, you want to see it transform for the better. And so that was my way of reminding us that we have a long way to go, but it's our responsibility to transform Liberia, to build Liberia better, to build Liberia differently. So that's what went into that speech. It was my love letter to Liberia, this heartfelt sort of exhortation to the country that we have to do things differently, that we can't continue on this road and expect the next 177 years to be different if we don't change course correct.
Yeah, the reactions were diverse. They were varied, and just like you said, someone saw it like a love letter. Someone else who have seen it as a rebuke. Someone else who have seen it as anything else. Does it make you feel okay that different people relate to it differently?
Yes. The reason I say yes is because the purpose of the speech was to touch every single fabric of society. And I believe that's fundamentally what I did. So I remember when I had arrived in Liberia around this time last year, there were a lot of people calling me and saying, "Oh, I know you're going to deal with the government." And I just laughed. Inside, I laughed because the speech was not just for the government. It was everybody. Everybody can see themselves reflected in that speech. And because everybody could see themselves reflected in the speech, that's why the response was so varied, right? That you could say it was a rebuke. I talked about the fact that this speech was about reconciliation and reckoning. You could say that it was a love letter. I mean, that was the way my students sort of viewed it. You could say that it was a clarion call to transformation. You could say so many things about the speech because everybody was reflected in that speech. And that was the purpose of the speech. You talked about what went into the speech. I wanted everyone to see themselves reflected in the speech and to reflect on that reflection, if that makes any sense to you, right? So that speech was not for the government. It was for the Liberian people. The government happens to be a part of that collective, but it was not just for the government. And everybody has a responsibility. I talked about this idea of the citizenship triad, right? Every single person in this country has a responsibility to transform Liberia such that the next 177 years looks fundamentally different.
Even the theme of the speech was
a radical agenda.
It was like coming out fighting. It was like coming out with like a blockbuster movie that just begins with real action. A radical agenda for reimagining Liberia.
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
and I also started with the Black Power salute. A lot of people notice that as well, right? This idea of when I picture Liberia, I see fists of all shapes and sizes raised in the air like this. So,
because our Declaration of Independence on July 26, 1847 was a revolutionary act of defiance. When you start a speech like that, one would expect that it should continue in that cadence and rhythm, and that actually did. Now, when you were developing it, touching on different things, we will go to the recommendations part and see. But what frame of mind were you in? What did you want to achieve? What the different things that you touched on? What was there? What were you thinking?
Yeah, I think if you look at the beginning of the speech, it really was about celebration. Right? This idea of a defiant act, the revolutionary act of defiance, declaring your independence when no other country in the continent of Africa existed, right, as a republic. And for me, that was a point of celebration. So I kept talking about the fact that Liberia holds a very special place in the Black kind of tradition, you know, and then harking back to even Haiti and saying that we owe homage to Haiti being the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, and then we were the first Black republic in the
and
African.
We pronounce it Haiti.
Haiti.
Okay.
So people in Haiti pronounce it Haiti. Okay. They don't say Haiti.
Okay.
Yeah. So it began with a message of hope that we do have something to celebrate, even though July 26 represents regression for some people. For the most part, as a collective, in that 177th year, we really had something to celebrate, right? That revolutionary act of defiance was something that we need to celebrate. But then I went on to say, 177 years has passed. What do we actually have to show for it?
Because
so that's where that point of reckoning and really reflecting on what have we actually achieved from that moment of revolutionary defiance.
Yeah, in the paragraph that precedes it, it says clearly what you just spoke about, but the succeeding paragraph goes on to say, yet when we talk about ourselves today in the narratives that we pass down from one generation to another, we tend to forget about the magnitude of 1847. We forget that this glorious land of liberty was once founded on abolitionist principles. We forget that dignity
once defined us. And I use that as a refrain throughout the speech because for me that was the kernel of the speech, this idea of dignity once defined us and it can still define us today. And that reminder, what does that mean?
It said that socio-culturally, socio-politically, have we found ourselves in a space where we do not think we're dignified as a nation, that we are better or we can be better than we are or perceived to be? Is that what you see?
So one of the things that I've said in a previous interview, I think it was held last August, is that fundamentally I believe that there's almost this sort of lack of self-esteem. You know, there's something that's crept into the body politic of Liberia that's very, very much about us not realizing that we come from this tradition of revolutionary defiance and almost accepting mediocrity as the norm, right? And I think we need to come out of that dream. It's almost like a reverie. We need to come out of that dream and realize where we've come from and where we need to go. So for me, that speech was really about reminding us where we came from. This idea of dignity once defined us, it must define us now.
Okay, so then we move on to recommendations that you made. So let us start with dignity redefining us today. Do you think we are getting on that path now, almost a year on?
Baby steps, very, very small baby steps. I mean, I can point to some things that I think are going well and certainly point to other things that aren't necessarily going well. So this idea of the radical agenda, right? So there are three things that I said encompass this radical agenda. So the first is redefining citizenship. So what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war nation? And not just domestic citizenship, but also diasporic transnational citizenship. So what are the requirements? What is required of us as citizens? Not just claiming rights and saying we're entitled to this, this, and this, but also fulfilling responsibilities, building relationships. All those things are really important. And those are the things that encapsulate my citizenship triad, that sort of triangle that says it's about rights, it's about responsibilities, but it's also about building relationships. The second recommendation I made in terms of this radical agenda is that we really have to tackle the twin challenges of structural violence. So all the rules, the norms, the regulations that fuel inequality and injustice. The second thing we need to tackle is unfreedom. So there's a development scholar by the name of Amartya Sen. He's won the Nobel Prize, Indian scholar. And he talks about the fact that development is not just participating in free market capitalism. It's not just about economic growth. It's really about building the capacities of individuals such that they can realize their freedoms, right? So some of the unfreedoms would be poverty, inequality, injustice, lack of political rights. So those are the things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about tackling structural violence as well as unfreedoms. And then the last thing that I talked about in terms of this radical agenda is this idea of privileging nation building just as much as we privilege state building. And to remind people what I meant by state building versus nation building is state building is really building the institutions of government, which I think are fundamentally important, right? So the judiciary, the legislature, the executive, those institutions that make a government function properly are very, very important. But equally important, and perhaps even more important, is this idea of nation building, right? Building a consensus around identity, right? Building relationships between individuals, but also building relationships between the institutions of government and the citizenry, right? Reconciliation, rehabilitation, all of those things are the hallmarks of nation building. So prioritize nation building as much as you prioritize state building, because for the past 20 years or so, my argument, and I've proved this in my scholarly work, is that we prioritize state building more than we do nation building.
Now, let me take you back to the question of citizenship.
Sure.
I've just returned from China, and I know how they take it. It's quite protected, quite difficult to infiltrate. Schooled in the UK, I also saw it's more of a liberal kind of way of becoming a citizen there. What sort of approach do you think will suit us? There are questions about who can be a Liberian citizen. There are questions about people losing their Liberian citizenship after assuming the citizenship of other countries. There are questions about people who are not blacks cannot become citizens here. So how do we work around that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll start with the last point that you made. And it's interesting that you made that point because the last time I was here was 2021 and I was talking about my new book, Africa's Negro Republics, which is an investigation or an exploration of this idea of the Negro Clause, right? Not only in Liberia, but in Sierra Leone. So I'm still gathering data for that book. And maybe I can come on later to talk about that particular issue. But in terms of how I conceptualize citizenship, and I talked about it in the speech, is that for me, citizenship is not just about identity. It's not about the fact that, or just that you have a passport that says Liberian, or that you were born in Liberia, or you have ancestry from Liberia. That's a part of it, but it's not the full picture, right? For me, citizenship is really about contribution. What kind of contributions have you made, both big and small? Are you paying your taxes? Are you abiding the laws? Are you abiding by the laws of the state? Are you building Liberian capacities, right? For me, that's what real citizenship is. It's not about the passport that you wave around. It's what you do with that identity that really makes you a citizen. And then furthermore, it's this idea of building relationships, right? So the relationship between citizens.
Before we get to the relationship part, the responsibility part. with a political culture that seemingly acknowledges the poverty of the people and usually would not push more into their own responsibility to the state. Is it not problematic?
No.
Politicians, for example, come to power, they may not be able to push the issue of paying taxes and the responsibilities of the citizens because the people suffering in our like Liberian parlance, and wanting to get the streets into a certain shape, to carry out certain developmental initiatives. Government just cannot do it because the ability of making citizens to understand or play their own role continues to hinder development. What can you say to that?
That's precisely why it's so important for all of us to feel and acknowledge the fact that we all have responsibility. So even from the cradle all the way to the grave, we have a responsibility to the state. And you do it within your own capacity, right? So anybody can play a role in being fundamentally a citizen. So the fact that I've just come down...
Is our political culture supportive of it?
Is our political culture supportive of it? Regardless of whether or not our political culture is supportive of it, we should still take that responsibility seriously, right? This idea of fulfilling responsibility. So for something as simple, Julius, as how do we keep our streets clean? It doesn't require money. It just requires a certain level of conscientiousness that I have a responsibility to take that trash and put it in the nearest trash can to keep my city clean. Or something as simple as, do we respect time? I even brought that up in the speech. Do we respect time? Do we respect our time? And do we respect each other's time? Right?
No, definitely.
All of that for me are the hallmarks of citizenship. Because when we think about citizenship, it's when people think about citizenship on the highest level, they think about it as political subjectivity, right? Participating in the political process. For me, that's a part of it, but that's not the whole story. That idea of fulfilling responsibilities is so varied, right? Picking up trash from the street, not throwing trash on the street, respecting people's time, coming to things on time. That is a form of citizenship, right?
It is. And I have noticed that those are hallmarks of developed societies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now,
and we can get there.
Yeah. And you spoke about own freedoms as well. I want you to expand on that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, Amartya Sen is this Indian Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's an economist. And what I love about his work is that most economists think about development as about, economic growth. He completely eschewed that idea. He said development is not, this idea of socioeconomic transformation is not just about economic growth. It's about a community's or state's ability to build the capacities of individuals within that particular state. So making sure that children have access to quality education. And the operative word here is quality education, not just any education, quality education. Making sure that people have political rights. So are you able to vote without fear or favor? Can you run for political office? Can you engage in the political discourse? Is there freedom of media and the press? Those are the kinds of freedoms that Amartya Sen talks about, right? And he says fundamentally that's what development is. It's about building the capacities such that citizens, individuals, collectivities can express these freedoms, can have these freedoms. And I think that's such a beautiful way of thinking about development beyond the sort of economic growth thesis. And he does that.
Now, and you also spoke about state building, nation building. You made recommendations around those. Are your recommendations being heard too?
So yes, I see in various sectors institutions of government functioning as they should. Not all of them, but some of them. And then I also see this emphasis on building relationships. So I just read, I think it was on the Daily Observer, because I was skimming through the headlines recently, and I just read that President Boakai visited Tuzon, and he was the, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm mistaken, he was the only post-war president who's actually visited Tuzon, and it was really a sort of form of reconciliation to say that, we know what happened here. We know that this is the ancestral home of President Doe. We're going to re-bury our past presidents who've been severely assassinated. And we're going to use that as a tool for reconciliation. But I also said in my speech, yes, reconciliation is important, peace is important. but the arc of a reimagined Liberia bends towards justice. So one of the recommendations that I made is, yes, we have this Office of the War and Economic Crimes Court, but the person who was selected, and I say selected, selected to lead the court, was done in a very untransparent manner, right? So if you're going to select somebody to lead such a very, very important, impactful, influential transitional justice institution, then it must be a process that's transparent. It must be a process that's merit-based. It must be a process that everybody has some sort of part to play in, right? Especially those who've been in the trenches of transitional justice for over 20 years. And President Boyka did take up that recommendation. And I want to actually stress that this was not my recommendation kind of in a vacuum. There were civil society actors who'd been pushing for this long before I even stated it. All I did was I reinforced that this should be a priority. And President Boyka actually did take this up.
Even though that office now is operational, and recently, recently they were crying for not being paid for 5 months.
I agree. That's where I was going, and I'm glad you jumped in. Absolutely. So beyond the symbolism of extending this executive order, because it's been extended for an additional 12 months, you have to make sure that it is capacitated, right? So that means ensuring that there's sufficient funding, and that sufficient funding must come from the government coffers. We can't rely on external actors to come and fund our transitional justice process. I mean, we can ask them to assist, but we must provide the lion's share of the Office of the War and Economic Crimes Court, right? And I think we need to move beyond the symbolism, because I think the government is really good at symbolism, sort of symbolic gestures, and actually put your money where your mouth is. If you say that this particular office is important, finance it. They shouldn't be on air talking about the fact that they haven't been paid for 5 months. That's, for me, is completely unacceptable.
Let's talk a bit about structural violence. You said somewhere here, though less visible than physical violence, structural violence is systemic, enduring, and ultimately more dangerous. Indeed, the true test of any nation is its willingness to transform the structural conditions that render so many of its citizens hopeless and hapless. Yeah. Advance a bit on structural violence and give us some examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So structural violence is a term that was developed by Johan Galtung. He's, I think, a Norwegian. He's considered the father of peace studies. So he came up with this idea of structural violence, and he says basically structural violence is the norms, the rules, the regulations, the systems that fuel inequality and injustice. A form of structural violence for me, and I brought it up in the speech, is the fact that you've got people who are making minimum wage or less than minimum wage in this country. That is a systemic, institutional, structural violence, right? So I know of people, and I'm not going to name institutions, that pay people less than the minimum wage of $143. I believe it's still $143. Why are we paying people less than $143 if the minimum wage is $143? So this idea of you have laws and rules and regulations, but they're completely defied by people in positions of power, right? So whether it's the private sector or the public sector, humanitarian sector, pay people the minimum wage. I also said that even the minimum wage is structurally violent, right? How can someone, let's say you have a family of 4, live on $143 a month, Julius? That is structural violence. That is inherently unequal. Right? When you've got other people who shall remain nameless, who are making 100 times more than that. Not because of their own, because they're much better than those people who are making 143.
Because they're in privileged
positions. And those privileged positions must be challenged. Right? So why is a member of the legislature making I don't know how much they make, but they make significant amounts of money, right? Exorbitant amounts of money. Or someone I was going to just say that. Appointed officials at these state-owned enterprises. Why are they taking home $10,000 a month? In a post-war country, I consider that to be structural violence. I consider that to be an egregious crime that we need to raise alarm about, right? That's a form of structural violence. I hope that helps people understand what I mean by that.
You made some other recommendations. And if inclusive growth is mentioned, then we must cancel contracts with poorly performing multinationals and renegotiate concession agreements that violate Liberian laws, including our labor laws and international human rights standards, including environmental governance.
Yes.
Are we on track for that, or are we still lazy
So
about.
I know the big concession company that's kind of been in the news most recently is ArcelorMittal, and they're supposed to, I believe their MD is supposed to be renewed in 2030. So they're on a charm offensive is what I'm calling, right? So they're making it seem as if they've done so much for Liberia in the past 20 years. They were the first post-war investor, the first major post-war investor in Liberia. And my suggestion is we shouldn't sign that concession agreement for renewal until we've done due diligence. And I think a lot of members of, or not a lot, a few members of the legislature have already raised alarm bells about ArcelorMittal. Let's look at all the other concessionaires, right? Look at the concession companies, look at their MDAs, figure out whether or not they're complying with the terms of those MDAs. And if they're not, Boakai and his administration have the wherewithal to cancel those concession agreements because it's a new administration, right? They definitely have the power and the will.
But he was praising them. He was saying that. He was praising them that they've done more for the country.
Well, I can't blame ArcelorMittal. What I can blame is the people who are supposed to be holding ArcelorMittal accountable.
That is what the president said. He was praising them. There's a clip of him
Praising ArcelorMittal?
Yes.
I wouldn't praise ArcelorMittal. Not 20 years you're in our country and you have nothing to show for it. But as I said, I'm not blaming ArcelorMittal. I'm blaming the Bureau of Concessions. We have a Bureau of Concessions, right? A National Bureau of Concessions. Yeah. So all along, the National Bureau of Concessions should have been making sure that ArcelorMittal was complying with the terms of their mineral development agreement, right? At the end of the day, these multinationals, their bottom line is making profit. They're not interested in corporate social responsibility or this new thing, ESG, environmental social justice or governance, right? They're not really interested in that. Until the government holds their feet to the fire, they're going to continue to not comply with the concession agreements. And that's our responsibility. That's our government's responsibility to ensure that we are instituting the most transparent measures of making them accountable.
On the domestic front, we must lead a values-based revolution against corruption. Are we on track?
I don't know if it's a values-based revolution. I don't think we're there yet. Definitely not there yet. I mean, you can put some people in jail. You can, I know there's been a lot of assets recovery, talk about assets recovery, which I think is important, like structurally and procedurally very important. There are also a number of cases that have been investigated by LAC, and people are going to jail, or at least they're being arrested and investigated, which I think is great. But when we talk about values-based revolution, it's really about what do we value as a society? Do we value accumulating mass amounts of wealth in the midst of poverty, right? Do we value plenty in the midst of poverty? Do we value wealth in the midst of want? We need to completely reconfigure what we value in society. Is it hard work? Do we value hard work? So that's what I mean by a values-based revolution, because at the end of the day, honestly, Julius, I remember when I worked for government, people would say if you leave government having not accumulated wealth, then you're stupid. That's a value judgment. Are we saying that we expect people in government to steal? And when they don't, then we call them stupid? That is coming from the public.
Yeah.
It's not coming from government officials, it's coming from public. So we have to think about what is it that we value? Do we value people honoring public service as something that is a service, not about accumulating wealth, not being political entrepreneurs is a term that I usually love. People who make government, being in government office, a business. Right? They're only in government to extract. They're only in government to accumulate wealth. So we really have to, as a collective, as a society, figure out what it is that we value. Do we value integrity? Do we value hard work? Do we value honesty? Are those the things that drive our society? Or is it hook and crook, kato? Is it this country, you see that technique? Those kinds of, the kind of informal corruption that we all engage in, but we don't call it corruption. We call it something different.
And then you said, in addition to prosecuting people in a soon-to-be-established National Anti-Corruption Court, we must also remove corruption-inducing expenditure from our budget, such as inflated salaries for elected and appointed officials, imported vehicles, fuel and scratch card allotments, blah, blah, blah. Now, you've been following, you've seen the two budgets that have come out so far. Have we made strides?
No, I think we need to increase budget allotments for education and health, for agriculture. Those, for me, should be the foundations. Obviously, infrastructure is important. Building the roads is really, really important. But I think social services, education and health, should really be our bread and butter. We should be increasing the budget, the percentage of the budget for those two social services. And then if we think about how do we mobilize, this idea of domestic resource mobilization, we should be able to feed ourselves. And in order to feed ourselves, we need to have food security, right? Because Liberia is food insecure. So we're constantly importing rice, our staple crop, and not, you know what I mean? So, creating an agriculture base such that we are eating what we grow and supporting farmers, supporting those who are in agribusiness, scaling up their agribusiness industries, and then making sure, I think I even said one of my recommendations was ensuring that a percentage of government contracts, procurement in terms of procurement, comes from scaling up agribusinesses. That's the only way to really transform society. I mean, if you look at Thomas Sankara, the late Thomas Sankara, when he was in office for just 4 years, he prioritized food security for Burkina Faso. And that's one of the ways they were able to grow in terms of revenue.
You also spoke about the legislature, talking about different things about them and being quite critical as well. You said to members of our national legislature, some of you are already campaigning for 2029, but I urge you to stop jockeying for power and grandstanding on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Do the work of the Liberian people now.
Yeah.
Are they doing the work? Because
some of them are, but I would say the vast majority of them are not.
What will you make of the impasse that developed not long after the independence that brought down the legislature almost to its knees?
Unfortunate and a waste of the people's time and resources, right? So the fact that you have these two, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know there's a case right now, so I don't want to be quoted as then infiltrated in the case, but the fact that you've got two people or two factions jockeying for power is precisely what I talked about when I said this idea of lawbreakers, right? So you have a legitimately appointed speaker who then is replaced by an illegitimately appointed speaker. And then there's this whole impasse as a result of that. Two men jockeying for power at the expense of the Liberian people. So I even wrote a piece called When Two Elephants Fight, the Grass Suffers. So the two elephants were the two factions of the house fighting, and who suffers in the process? The Liberian people. For me, that was an egregious, pretty much held the country out in for what, 6 months?
More
no
than
progress.
7, 8 months.
7, 8 months. Yeah, held the country hostage because these two factions of political leadership believed that they were more legitimate than the other person. We have to do better, legislature. Members of the House, we have to do better. Members of the Senate, we have to do better. You were elected by the Liberian people to serve them, not to serve your own selfish interests.
You spoke about refashioning of like the CU, the national anthem, national awards, among others. We went on to also call for the adoption of one of Liberia's most widely spoken languages as our national language and embrace Liberian English as our lingua franca.
Yes, some people said because I'm Bassa and Crew that I would have selected Bassa and Crew, and the answer is no, actually. I think Pele is the most widely spoken language. So I was alluding to that.
Have we made any strides?
On that front, not so much. I mean, one of the things that I did, and I haven't said this publicly, but all of those recommendations that you've mentioned from the speech, I actually created a matrix, like a whole table. Okay. The table is about 4 or 5 pages with all of the recommendations listed, and I passed it on to the executive mansion. I'm not really sure what happened with that, but after reading that particular matrix again before coming in today, when I was looking at the arrest agenda for inclusive development, the fact that they included the word inclusive is very important for me because I did talk about this idea of inclusive growth. There are remnants of the speech and the recommendations of the speech in the arrest agenda for inclusive growth. So one of the things that I talked about throughout the speech, or I mentioned it very briefly, is this idea of investing in our creative industries and not necessarily investing in extractives, right? So taking finite resources and exporting it without any sort of value addition, no manufacturing, nothing. Switch from the extractives and really focus on our writers, our dramatists, our singers, our creatives. Your guests who were just in the studio were talking about a creative arts camp, which I thought is so fantastic, right? We've got creative people in this country who are completely being ignored, right? We're not investing in that. And that could be a cultural export to the world, right? We could make billions. Nollywood makes billions by exporting Nigerian film. The other thing is, what is it? The music, Nigerian music, is exported. It's become this multi-billion-dollar industry because they know that investing in their creative artists is really, really important. So there's a mention of the creative industries in the Arrest Agenda for Inclusive Development, which I thought I was really very, very excited about. The other thing I talked about is the fact that the development agenda has to be Liberian-led and it has to be Liberian-financed. So I was actually quite disappointed when I read the Arrest Agenda for Inclusive Development that what the government is proffering is that 30% of this $8 billion over 5 years to fund the Arrest Agenda comes from the government. 30% is too low. We need to do better than that, right? That's a third of the budget for the Arrest Agenda. We should be coming up with the lion's share. And I know, 35% they said it comes from the foreign direct investment, but the government budget needs to be more than 30% to fund the Arrest Agenda. And we can't rely on donors. We can't rely on external entities. I mean, we've got a huge Liberian diaspora that's willing to transform the country to contribute. We need to create conditions for that to take place.
This is the OK Conversation on OKFM 99.5. We have with us Dr. Robtel Pailey having a high-level conversation about our country, going back to a speech she delivered last year at the Independence. You started off on the international front. I want to take you back there.
Sure.
In this paragraph, you said, on the international affairs front, we must not allow foreign financiers to hijack our development process. We cannot and will not build a new Liberia for Liberians if we blindly pander to the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and their proxies in the United Nations. Expand on that. And have we made progress away from that, or we are still hooked in their clutches?
I think we're still hooked. I think there's a lot of pandering to the international financiers. I mean, you know what? I'm going to be honest and say I get it. I understand. But at the end of the day...
But how could we do it differently?
I think there are so many ways to do it differently. And I often reference, my students are so tired of me hearing about, or they're so tired of me talking about Thomas Sankara, this idea of the fact that he eschewed international aid and said, no, we have to be able to do this on our own. Burkina Faso is a land of upright people, right? They stand on their own 2 feet. They have dignity, right? That's where I would like to see Liberia go. So in terms of the IMF and the World Bank or a lot of these international financiers, we've already seen the landscape of aid, what's happened in the past 6 months in terms of aid, and not just within the context of USAID, but there are other countries, France, Germany, even where I live, the United Kingdom, that has consistently reduce their aid budgets because they're all now concerned about NATO losing funding from the United States, right? So they have to increase their defense funding and decrease their the percentage of their GDP or GNI that goes towards aid. So as far as I'm concerned, aid is not a viable development strategy. Relying on external financing for something as simple as building a domestic resource base is not a viable development strategy. So we have to figure out how to negotiate. So the late John Magufuli, I always talk about him, even though he was problematic on so many different levels, from Tanzania, the president of Tanzania. When I interacted with him when I worked for the African Development Bank, and I found his approach to be so interesting. So we would sit at a table with John Magufuli in Dodoma, which is now the political capital of Tanzania. And I was working with the African Development Bank president, President Adesina. And President Magufuli said, these are my priorities. If you, the African Development Bank, can't fund this, and this, and you can go, the door is right there. I'd like to see us as a nation stand up to these international financiers, whether they be regional institutions like the African Development Bank or global institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and negotiate in such a way that we maintain our dignity. Because at the end of the day, these countries all they're interested in is making sure that you have loans, and those loans have to be paid back in very, very high interest rates, right? So we have a role to play in terms of that negotiation process. We shouldn't just kind of abdicate our responsibility and say, oh, whatever the IMF says or whatever the World Bank says or whatever the donor X says, then we just comply. No, we need to negotiate, and we need to negotiate better. And fundamentally understand that aid is not going to transform this country. Liberia's resources, Liberia's people are going to transform these countries, our country.
You spoke about the outsized influence of the United States.
I knew you were going there. Go ahead.
So, does Trump's reshifting of American foreign policy does it align with what you were saying? Does it place us in a position to say, okay, we have to really see about standing on our 2 feet ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talked about the fact that this special relationship that we think we have with the United States, the so-called special relationship, only exists in our imagination. And there have been so many people who've told me that statement was so prophetic, because what's happening in terms of U.S.-Liberia relations now, I hope it's reminded people or proven that what I had to say was true. At the end of the day, there's no special relationship as far as I'm concerned. The U.S. will always look out for its own interests. It's about time that Liberia look out for its own interests without this kind of dream-like quality of our so-called relationship with the United States, because we don't have a special relationship. Right now, I think Liberia is on the verge of even being listed as one of the countries that has a visa ban. And let me say to your listeners, please, that was not because of me. Right? Well, it was not because of my speech. This was a long time coming.
So how do we do it differently? We see the U.S. as perhaps father-son kind of relationship, or
the United States people can't hear their ear.
Yeah. So how do we do it differently? Because given the fact that they are the most influential country on the planet, and they could keep you in their reins in any way that they wanted to, how could you do it differently?
So it's precisely what I said, this idea of looking for strategic partnerships out of that imaginary relationship that we had. And it's not to say we don't engage with the United States. Of course we do, right? You can't exist in the 21st century without engaging with the United States. I'm very, very well aware of that, and I'm not under any sort of illusion that you don't engage with the United States. But you engage with the United States on your own terms, as much as you possibly can, and you look at other strategic relationships, alliances that might work better for you, right? I know a lot of people were saying, oh, she's supporting Liberia's relationship with Russia and China. There are all kinds of commentary around that. When I say strategic relationships, I'm not talking about just China and or Russia. In fact, in many respects, I'm very wary of a potential relationship with Russia, and I'm very wary of getting in China's clutches, right? There are other countries in our continent that we can build strategic relationships with, right? This African free trade area agreement, right? That's a way to build strategic relationships with the continent, right? What is our comparative advantage? What are other countries' comparative advantage? Can we trade with those other countries that have resources that we may not necessarily have, right? Can we build a manufacturing base in such a way that we can export condoms to the West African sub-region, ECOWAS, right? That's what I mean by strategic partnerships. For me, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a Pan-Africanist to the core. So when I talk about strategic partnerships, the first thing that I'm thinking about is our own backyard, ECOWAS. Because the other regions of the continent of Africa, I would say that's where we need to be looking, especially with this AFCFTA trying to get off its feet.
It is believed as a continent we have too much, a whole lot of resources, younger population.
We don't manufacture anything. We always export. We export, we extract. We extract, we export. And we need to really change that, right? So where are the special economic zones that we can build in ECOWAS, right? So what is it? Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have cocoa. Why are they not involved in the multi-billion-dollar industry that is the chocolate industry? Why are they exporting cocoa and not making chocolate and exporting chocolate? You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we have the resources. It's just a matter of being very strategic in manufacturing those resources in such a way that we are benefiting from the global supply chain. We can't constantly be the exporters of basic commodities. That is not how you grow your revenue.
Her name is Dr. Pailey. I'm sure I'll have her here for a part 2. But let's take a few calls. We have just 6 minutes to go, so let's take a few calls on 777-700-995, 555-995-995, the numbers to call, and you will be through. Welcome. Let's hear you.
Good evening, Julius.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Julius, for having me on your platform. I'm CRC Modern Super Junior of the Interlogic Class, the Script 14. Let me say good evening to Dr. I am strongly one of her supporters. I admire her influence and her level of education. Very young person, and she has achieved so much. I've learned a lot from her, and I think, Julia, the country can actually tap into her knowledge. And I haven't read a whole lot essay about her, but just not listening to conversation on the platform. I think what I want to agree with her on is how we can focus on strategizing Liberia foreign relations. I think we need to have something on the table. Our country will have so much, but what is wrong with this country that things cannot get better? I think the president, by now, the president should be calling such a person, bringing her on the round table because she has so much to offer to our country at a very young age. Thank you, Julius. At least I have a time to talk with Dr. Robtel Pailey. I listened to her in the time she was given inaugural speech. So many backlashes. Thanks so kindly.
Thanks so kindly. Welcome. Let's hear you.
Journalist Julius James. This is journalist Octavian Tucker Williams, former Vice President of the Republic of Liberia. Two things. I just called to commend the dad in the studio. She is a pan-Africanist and a revolutionary figure. When you do a background analysis, like I was saying to somebody in this car I'm driving, I said usually people like that they Rastafarians. But there's one advice I like to give her, please. Please do me one favor. I take all here to hold your lay feet. Whenever you approaching us, just reduce the too much series and just do it ordinary Liberian way. So the president is telling the lay make better boy in the market can understand you. I beg you, Mama.
Okay, thanks so kindly.
Thanks a lot.
Very good feedback. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate
Octavian,
that.
Dr. Atimus Gay says, Julius, welcome back. Prof. Robtel hits the point. Nation building is the overarching goal of building socio-cultural cohesion, the bedrock of democracy, economic, institutional, infrastructural, and security guarantees. Noam Chomsky indeed is worth reading, as nation building is not just a statecraft issue, but genuinely seeking the common good. I read him from an educational standpoint. He's quite a guy. Let's take this will be the second to last call. Welcome. Let's hear you.
Yeah, how you doing? Cheers.
I'm fine. Go ahead.
Mike Fire David here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I like Robtel's stance as a pan-Africanist, but I actually want to ask her how does she gauge the African continent's own accession to the West, where we exceed everything to the West, right? And a case in point is Europe has Russia, France, and Great Britain on the UN Security Council. Africa has none. Africa cannot even fight for a seat. But we say fighting that we can say, yeah, Africa, we want to be a pan-Africanist, and Africa should collaborate. We should do. She said something about comparative advantage, right? And when really the West, we have comparative advantage as Liberia, especially with iron ore, cocoa, rubber. But we prefer dealing with the West than even an African country. So I just want to know where she stands on that.
Okay, thanks so kindly. Let me squeeze in this one on the international line. Welcome, let's hear you.
Good afternoon, Julius. Frank Gibson, a call from Paris.
Go ahead quickly.
Good afternoon to your guests. Julius, when people talk about Russia, people always feel or think about military. But there are a lot of things countries can get from Russia: expertise in the agriculture sector, in the energy sector. Those are areas where if people actually be in real conversation with the Russian Federation without the interference of the United States. Because the United States always feel that when people align with Russia, it's in the military area. But it's not always the case. Look at Mali, for example. Let's forget about the military aspect. Mali is really growing in the energy sector. That would be one of the energy hubs in the entire region. And this is city Russia is trying to bring in Burkina Faso in energy. But people feel that when you talk about Russia, it's military, it's gun, it's weapon. No, it's not always the case.
Okay.
And that's the point.
Thanks so kindly, Frank Gibson. This person says, please ask Dr. Robtel Pailey for her overall rating of the government, considering a deep dive into the government's commitment to the people of Liberia, irrespective of 2024 oration. Let's squeeze in the the president of the civil servants of
Julius, I'm going to forget all these questions. I'll try to remember them.
Yeah, that's the final one. Quickly, let's hear you, sir.
Thank you, Judah Chair. I want to thank the Dad in studio, actually. Dad, you are touching all. We have to think about nation building. Our leaders, especially the national legislature, officials that there have to work for the country, and the issue that has to do with comparative advantage. Liberia has so many advantages. We have our from the extractive industry, even from the agriculture sector. Liberia is just so blessed with abundant resources. But our leaders have to think about nation. They have to put that nation first before any other. Thank you very much, Robtel.
Okay, thanks so kindly. We go back to her now.
Okay, I think the first caller was talking about the fact that I need to remove some of the series from my mouth. You are absolutely right. I think when I get very passionate about something, the series comes out because that's where I grew up. But you're absolutely right. I'll try to tone down the language and make it more accessible. Another caller talked about the African Union and its place geopolitically, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we just gained a 2-year seat, non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which I think...
They call our seat non-permanent.
It is non-permanent. And I think if you look at the permanent members of the Security Council, they're very, very much the sort of post-World War II kind of relic. And I think if we can use, because I didn't understand the point of us trying to get the non-permanent seat, but if we can use that leverage to advocate for reconfiguring the UN Security Council, I think that's where we really make a case for a country from the continent of Africa being represented on the UN Security Council. Other ways of leveraging the partnership with Africa and making it a bold and strong force within the context of standing on its own 2 feet is because the countries of the continent of Africa, you've got regional powerhouses like Nigeria and West Africa, South Africa and Southern Africa. You've got Kenya and East Africa. Besides those big powerhouses, most countries in the continent of Africa have a very small voice. But if we work through our regional institutions like an ECOWAS or a SADC or an EAC, then we can have a much, much more powerful voice. The other thing that really disappoints me is I think the African Union has completely lost its touch with reality, right? How do we build the institution of the African Union in such a way that it becomes a voice of change within these institutions like the G20 or the UN, and so forth and so on? So I think there's a lot of reckoning that needs to take place within the context of the continent. We need to have an internal reckoning, regionally, in order to really have a voice on the global stage. Because right now, people don't treat us as if they should respect our wishes at all. But that's our own fault, right? Okay. It's our own fault.
Dr. Pailey, thanks so kindly for being here. We look forward to another one. But we see you around Independence time. Will you be orator again?
It's funny. I was at a supermarket yesterday and somebody said, "Oh, you came to blast at the people again." I said, "My not inside 2025." No, I didn't come to do another oration, but I have come to do a series of different engagements. So I'm teaching my course at the University of Liberia, and I've expanded it to AMEU, Stella Marie, UMU. So it's not just UL. I'm also involving all these universities.
Okay.
I'm also doing a series of different engagements.